Hello and welcome everyone to this session as part of Forum Europe's 10th Annual European Data Protection and Privacy Conference. My name is Eline Chivot and I am Senior Policy Analyst for the Center for Data Innovation. We're a think tank based in Brussels and in DC, and we're active in tech policy. Today I'm with you to moderate a panel on the GDPR and particularly how can the EU deliver the full potential of its data protection principles. I will first introduce our guests before we dive into the conversation. To participants following the discussion on the delegates platforms, if you'd like to tweet and react on social media, please feel free to use the hashtag EUData2020 and to use Forum Europe's handle. Please also do send us your questions via the chat, as we will ensure there is some time for interaction between our speakers today and all of you. Now, to set the scene first and to give us a little bit of food for thought, so the GDPR is mostly heralded as a success. We've also heard in previous speeches that it has meant more empowerment for citizens. Citizens are more aware of their rights, and we also hear the regulation would have contributed to fostering trustworthy innovation. However, policymakers themselves have identified a number of areas for improvement, mainly with regard to the harmonization and consistency of implementation and enforcement of the GDPR across the EU. And some of those challenges were highlighted by the multiple different approaches taken by member states when applying GDPR during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, during this session, we will aim to take stock of the actual benefits of the GDPR, but also to explore how the outstanding challenges and concerns around compliance and enforcement can be best addressed amid the continuous development of new data-driven innovations, which will be critical factors to Europe's recovery from the pandemic, but also to its data economy. So we will debate as well what can be improved to assist citizens in the exercise of their rights, and also how can we create legal certainty for European businesses moving forward in order to strengthen their innovation capacity. And there are several things that I'd be curious to hear more from our panelists today. The purpose of GDPR is not to punish businesses, certainly it is to better protect the privacy of EU residents, but that will become more of a challenge if companies are unable to get accurate and timely guidance from DPA. So what is being done by member states to provide those authorities with the necessary human, financial, technical resources to properly enforce the data protection rules? And what are the impacts of the regulation on businesses, especially SMEs, and on the tech community at large? How also has it impacted the development and the adoption of new technologies like AI? Hopefully, we'll also get to talk about the pandemic's implications on the conversation around privacy in Europe, and we'll get to talk about the perception of GDPR by individuals and what can be done in order to provide them more rights, especially when talking about data portability. Now, with me today to discuss all this, we're lucky to be in good company, starting with Olivier Micol, Head of Unit for Data Protection at DG Just, Dale Sunderland, Deputy Commissioner at the Data Protection Commission of Ireland, or DPC, William Malcolm, your Director of Privacy Legal at Google, and then we have Lorena Marciano, who's Legal Director, Global Data Strategy at Cisco, and Estelle Massé, who's Senior Data Analyst at Access Now. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're a little bit delayed, but we'll be able to extend the time of our session first. So without further notes on my side, let's just start with you, Olivier. What is the current state? What can you tell me about the current state of implementation across member states? And have we made it to this one continent, one law, or maybe the so-called data Switzerland. Maybe you can tell us a little bit also about the main outcomes of the last evaluation.
Thank you very much, Eileen, and thank you very much for having me here today. It's a great pleasure to speak to all of you and to be on this great panel. Indeed, as you just mentioned, and as was mentioned by Vice President Jourova at the opening of this event, I mean, this first evaluation report of the GDPR by the Commission came in June, very shortly after, in fact, the start of the application of the GDPR, and it probably reflects the fact that a lot is expected from the GDPR, probably more than from other EU legislation, because it touches on fundamental rights, because it touches on the digital economy. So there is a lot of expectation, which means sometimes a lot of criticism and a lot of debate. But as we pointed out in this very detailed report, it's not only a communication, it's a very heavy staff working document with a lot of details that I encourage you to read if not already done so. We see that overall, as was pointed out by Vice President Jourova, I mean, we consider that it has been a successful first 2 years, and that we would not reopen the regulation at this stage. I think it's a very wide consensus about this approach by the Council, by the stakeholders, by the civil society organizations. So we consider that for the time being, I mean, although there are a number of improvements to be made, and I will mention a few of them soon. Overall, the GDPR has been up to the task. We had highlighted 4 main findings. I mean, one is the fact that I think a lot of citizens are now fully aware of the importance of data protection, and we published at the same time with the Fundamental Rights Agency a survey showing that around 70% of EU citizens are aware about the GDPR, so are aware about an EU legislation, which is not so common, and the same proportion is aware that they can turn to national data protection authorities to defend their rights. We also say that the governance system has been put in place with independent European data protection authorities, with strengthened powers and harmonized powers, and cooperating within this European Data Protection Board. Paul Adamson mentioned earlier that indeed we put in the report that the work of putting together a truly common European data protection culture among the data protection authority is still work in progress. The data protection authority comes with different background, a different history, and it's a task basically to create that trust between them, to create a fully let's say common approach. And this is something which we know the European Data Protection Board and the data protection authorities are working on very extensively, and this is something really which is a necessity to a proper implementation of the GDPR. We mentioned also the company and indeed the catastrophe that was announced before the GDPR. It was not so long ago, a bit more than 2 years, has not materialized. And in fact, the feedback we hear from many companies that it was an opportunity to do an inventory of the data available in the company, sometimes to have a more rationalization of the use of data, to be able to raise data protection at the level of the company boards, which was not the case before. Of course, we know that in the case of small and medium-sized companies, there is efforts to be done to reach to them. And as we highlighted in our report, we think that the national data protection authorities have undertaken a lot of activities already vis-a-vis the SMEs, but that this effort should be supported, and this is why we are providing this financial support to national data protection authorities, and we will continue to do so in the future. And we have to make use of all the toolbox of the GDPR. Code of conduct is a very important tool to specify the application of the GDPR in a given sector. We have just published a standard contractual clause for controller and processor in the EU and for international transfer, and I'm sure that Bruno Giancarli, my colleague, will mention that in the next panel on international dimension. So, but we have also this standard contractual code for controller and processor within the EU. And indeed, another element we highlighted in the report is that the GDPR proved to be a flexible tool at the end of the day. Several speakers mentioned the role of the GDPR in the COVID-19 pandemic response. Not only was the GDPR not an obstacle to putting in place, let's say, the necessary tool, but it's also essential for the acceptability by citizens of the new technological tool. We have seen all this debate on tracing apps, and the Commission guidance followed by the European Data Protection Board guidelines on this tracing app, I think have set, let's say, the condition for the trust of citizens into these apps. But as we said, there are still a number of improvements, and this one is really improvement on implementation enforcement. And this we have to take into account that we are still only 2 years in the implementation of the GDPR, but indeed enforcement is something which, as highlighted by Vice President Jourova, is something that we need to focus on collectively. It's not that there has not been any enforcement until then. We hear a lot about fines, etc. Although the Data Protection Authority have even much more powerful tool than fines. They can stop a certain processing, etc., which has a more deterrent effect than fines, in fact. But if we focus on fines, you will see that in our report we say that until the end of 2019, just to take this period, there has been more than 780 fines. So it's not that enforcement is not there. The Data Protection Authority are there, but of course there are some complex cases involving cross-border decision, especially for big tech company, and I'm sure that Dale will speak about that. But a key condition for that is for the Data Protection Authorities to have the sufficient resources, and you mentioned that before. We have also to consider that the situation is not completely bleak, because in the first between 2016 and 2019, there has been a more than 40% increase in the staff and 50% increase in budget on average in national data protection authorities. So of course they need more resources. We are pushing for that as a Commission, but it's not as if nothing has been achieved so far. And we were very glad to hear, for instance, that in October, the Irish Data Protection Commissioner will be allocated, let's say, an increased budget and staff in for 2021. So what we need is more efficient working arrangement between data protection authorities. They are working on that. And we, as a Commission, fully support this work. On the uniform implementation by member states, indeed, there are some margin for specifications still left by the GDPR, for instance, in the health and research sector. And this is why we pushed for having guidelines by the European Data Protection Board in research. And we submitted a number of questions from the Commission in order to have a number of aspects being specifically specifically addressed in this context. And we see that in a number of cases, for instance, the reconciliation of the rights to data protection and the freedom of expression, there are different approaches taken by member states, and this is something we are discussing with the member states. So to conclude, indeed, I mean, what we see is that the GDPR is really a stepping stone for a number of big initiatives taken at national level. Commissioner Jourova, Vice President Jourova mentioned DSA, but we also had the publication a few days ago of the Data Governance Act by the Commission, which basically set up a condition for the sharing of data, for the establishment of common European data spaces. It will be followed by sectoral data spaces in the field of health, mobilities, etc. And the GDPR is really at the core of this approach. It was very rightly highlighted that GDPR is not only about data protection, but also data flows by the DPS. And indeed, in all these initiatives, the GDPR will play a key role. And there was some question on portability mentioned earlier. Here also, I mean, all this initiative, we will see how the rights provided by the GDPR, including for portability, can also be implemented and facilitated in all these initiatives. So I will stop there as an introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That really packed a punch, actually, but I still have questions for you because of some of the things you said. So you said, you know, there are high expectations, GDPR is successful standard, and you're mentioning how people's awareness has grown and how their trust has grown. I mean, the last time I checked the barometer of the Commission, though, the results were not very good. I think there was 4 out of 5, of Europeans that felt they had no control over their personal information, and that you know, there was just you know, trust in on the internet was one of the barometers was not necessarily good. So I'd like maybe for you to tell me a little bit more about how that has changed, and also considering that the terms and conditions being one way to raise awareness potentially are still maybe not read by all of us. Another thing I wanted to maybe probe you further on is, you know, you talked about the new initiatives that are on the table, like the GGA, the TSA, you know, the discussions we're having on data flows. The objective of the GDPR was to raise trust and to ensure rights for individuals. Aren't these new initiatives sort of maybe for admitting that the GDPR hasn't gone far enough, or maybe has failed on delivering this objective in particular? And finally, looking at the feedback of some countries to in a report to the EDPB in February, you know, there was feedback from the Netherlands saying things like, you know, this bureaucratic burden, there's a lack of clarity that makes businesses hesitant to try new solutions. The Germans said that users have felt considerable uncertainty. So why add more potential rules, and what, you know, would you respond to this feedback that wasn't necessarily positive? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, you mentioned the Eurobarometer's numbers, and in fact, the figure you mentioned, I think they are coming more or less from the same Eurobarometers, because we had a list of questions, and indeed, you have at the same time an increased awareness of the citizen about the importance of their personal data, and an increased, let's say, consciousness, and therefore there is the feeling sometimes that they do not control fully their data. At the same time, the fact that they know that now there is a regulation in place, that now there are data protection authorities in place, and the increasing, let's say, complaints to the data protection authorities also shows that increasingly citizens are turning to these data protection authorities. They are also turning to civil society organizations, and then we might have a discussion on, having civil society organization representing consumers or citizens dealing with breaches or infringement of the GDPR. But there are tools provided under the GDPR. So I would say that this, with the knowledge, came sometimes more the realization of the risks. And indeed, it is our duty and it is the role of enforcement to create this trust that indeed there are rules and these rules are properly enforced. And I think that most of the business takes this rule very, let's say, seriously. And of course, when it is not the case, there should be a proper enforcement. You mentioned also the new initiative and whether the GDPR did not go far enough. I think that the GDPR shows all this flexibility because it is principle based, and the fact that it can accommodate these new initiatives, which have different objectives. If you look at the Data Governance Act, the idea is to facilitate putting together non-personal and personal data for the development of the digital economy, and also let's say favoring the emergence of intermediaries for the collection of data, intermediaries that can be trusted. But all these rules, all this development are fully, let's say, built on the GDPR. So there will be no relaxation of the GDPR when building this common data space. But we can fully envisage, for instance, that you as a citizen with a rare disease, you want to be able to share medical data in order to foster research about this rare disease. What is important is that since it is very sensitive data, you can do that in a way that you can trust the intermediaries, that you can trust that your data will not be leaked, etc. So this is this type of initiative that are being built, for instance, through the Data Governance Act.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being patient with all my questions. I'm going to follow up with Dale before moving to Lorena, because I know Lorena has to leave at 11, so I have to make sure you get enough time to share your views. But first with Dale, representing the Data Protection Authority of Ireland. So what is the situation of those DPAs, of the data protection authorities, in terms of the resources and effectiveness, which is something that Olivier mentioned? What is your assessment of the enforcement mechanisms, cooperation mechanisms, and particularly, how has it been for the Irish authority? As we know, you have a lot on your plate.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to join this morning's event. There's some really good questions there, and I just by reflecting, as others have already this morning said, that the Commission did give a largely positive report of the GDPR in its 2-year report. But like any honest report, it did identify some areas for improvement, and I think we're all agreed on those issues that need to be tackled. It is important to note, however, that the report did conclude that it was too soon to judge the impact and function of the one-stop shop. And just as a kind of a scene setter, it's important to recall as well that for supervisory authorities, the GDPR had in particular two transformative impacts. Firstly, the functions, responsibilities, and enforcement powers of authorities were significantly broadened and strengthened. And for example, in the context of the DPC, we were given the power to impose administrative fines and other corrective measures for the first time. Secondly, it was the creation of the one-stop shop and the cooperation and consistency mechanisms. And we should also remember and recall that much of that structure was without precedent in the EU. And so, while I would say very good progress has been made, naturally enough, implementing this novel regulatory landscape has not been without its challenges. And we've even recently seen those challenges in our inquiry into the Twitter case, which has been the first brought by any DPA through the process to Article 65 consistency under the GDPR. I would say that we are still learning how to effectively work this new regime, and we have yet a bit to go. The Commission's report also highlights the imperative of properly resourcing data protection authorities, and you proposed that question to me. And so for the DPC, it's been largely a good news story, I'm happy to say. In 2017, the year before the GDPR took effect, the DPC's total funding amounted to €7.5 million, and we had a total staff of 85. Next year, in 2021, the Irish government has provided funding of 19.1 million, and this will facilitate additional recruitment and help us to get our total staff to around 180 in Q1 of 2021 and approximately 210 staff by the end of next year. But however, that said, we also recognise the need for us to continue growing beyond 2021, and we will be seeking additional funding to enable that from the Irish government in future years. So we're continuing to consolidate and build on an already very talented, committed and professional team, and increasingly the impact of our expanded resources can be seen in the regulatory outcomes that we are achieving. Of course, when we reflecting on the GDPR as regards the activities of supervisory authorities, I would make the point that it's necessary to take a broad perspective and look at the activity across all of the SA's functions. And of course, although the role of the DPC is internationally prominent by virtue of our lead supervisory authority responsibilities for the tech giants located in Ireland, and though that is hugely important for us, it's not the only measure of the work we do. And in fact, 8% of the complaints we receive are domestic oriented in nature, with only 12% relating to cross-border issues. And I'd just like to briefly highlight some of the kind of key activities in 2020 that demonstrate the breadth of our work. This year to date, we received almost 4,300 complaints and almost 5,500 breach notifications. And contrary to comments that recently in a public forum that the DPC only looks at one complaint in 100, in fact, in this year to date, we have completed and concluded 4,200 complaints, and we currently have 2,500 on hand. A number of our larger scale investigations concluded this year, and decisions in 6 of those cases have been published. And all of those included sanctions and corrective measures, and in 4 administrative fines were imposed. We're also very active on the litigation front, with currently 42 live cases before the courts, and 26 of those are appeals against decisions of the DPC taken by both companies as well as organisations. We also continue to prioritise the publication of guidance, and we'll very soon be publishing detailed guidance on the data protection rights of children under the GDPR. And earlier this year, we published detailed guidance on cookie compliance, and following a 6-month period for organisations to bring themselves into compliance, we have now commenced cookie enforcement actions. We're also very active on our consultation and supervision work, and that team has dealt with almost 1,000 requests from private and public bodies this year seeking guidance on the correct interpretation and application of the GDPR as they develop and implement new products and services. We're particularly busy around COVID-related projects, such as Ireland's exposure notification app and the Irish government's Back to Work Safely protocol. We also engage with the internet, and this is important, the internet and social media companies on new products and services before they are launched. And one notable example in 2020 has been Facebook dating, where we were actively engaged in ensuring that that product, any issues of concern were addressed before it launched. So the aim here is to resolve problems before they arise, and there is perhaps no glory in prevention, but we believe it is an important element of the regulatory toolkit to engage early with companies to achieve effective results. And of course, another critical area for the DPC is the operation of the one-stop shop. Many of you will be aware that the first draft decision from the DPC in relation to a Twitter case was circulated to the other authorities under Article 60, the Article 60 cooperation procedure in May 2020. The draft decision was the first big test of the cooperation procedure, and it wasn't without its teething pains, I have to say. A number of objections were raised by other authorities, some of which conflicted with one another. So the DPC ultimately had no choice but to invoke the Article 65 consistency mechanism. And the board took its decision in December, and that's the European Data Protection Board. And in line with the timeline specified in the GDPR, the DPC is required to finalise the case by the 17th of December. So you can watch that space. Just on cooperation among supervisory authorities, it is quite rightly an issue that continues to be a topic of much discussion at the EDPB. Let's say the continuing challenge is to put into practice a level of effective cooperation and information sharing. including in the context of the one-stop shop, that is consistent with legal obligations under the GDPR, that strikes the right balance, acknowledging the independence of supervisory authorities, and which also is consistent with national procedural requirements. And as a group, we also have yet to fully exploit the potential of the GDPR's cooperation information sharing tools such as mutual assistance and joint operations. So just in conclusion, progressing to conclusion, our cross-border inquiries is a top priority for the DPC. And while we fully acknowledge the speed of the investigative process isn't moving often as fast as we would like, the reality is that investigations of this type take time. And there are some who would say the outcome of our investigation should be self-evident. However, ultimately, and perhaps our conclusions will be the same, however, the process and decisions by which those conclusions are reached must be sustainable in law. And that requires all the necessary procedural steps to be followed with great care and diligence, including during the Article 60 and 65 phases. And as we have seen, supervisory authorities' decisions will be challenged, and where procedural deficiencies are found, those decisions will be struck down by the courts. Just lastly, the GDPR, and particularly the one-stop shop, is still in its infancy. There is yet much growing to be done to reach a more mature functioning of the one-stop shop in terms of cooperation between supervisory authorities. And this is not just an Irish issue, and Ireland is far from being the only lead supervisory authority. There's a duty on all of us within the European Data Protection Board to interpret and apply the GDPR's cooperation and consistency mechanisms accurately, faithfully, and within that framework to work better together to drive higher data protection standards and protect the individual's right to data protection in a manner that is balanced and fair to all stakeholders. So I can assure you the DPC continues to be fully committed to the task, and as I'm sure are all of our European Data Protection Board colleagues. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dale. I'm still going to probe you on something because I'm aware that there was something like an 80% increase in the total number of complaints that you received, maybe a few hundreds under the Data Protection Act that were prior to the GDPR, and up to 8,000, as you mentioned, under the GDPR for you. Yet you just told us the one-stop shop mechanism is just in its infancy, so we should give it more time to figure out, how to maybe adjust the system or maybe not. But also what struck me in your contribution is that you've listed the number of fines, of cases that you've worked on, that you solved. Should this be the way in which we should assess the performance of DPAs? Because I know there's a lot of, suggestions that the GDPR lacks teeth because there's not enough fines. Should enforcement means more fine, more penalties, or should it be involving other parameters like general awareness about the law, or shifting mindsets or things like that?
Lee, that's a really, really good question, and of course the headline stories continuous basis around fines and enforcement. And there is a part for that. There's absolutely, and a big positive of the GDPR is that it does strengthen the enforcement toolkit of data protection authorities. But it is much broader than that, and that's what I was trying to highlight in my comments, that the metric by which effective regulation, can be measured is more than just fines and enforcement actions. Olivier mentioned codes of conduct. I talked about guidance. And across the board, there are tools and measures by which the GDPR gives us that we really have to start leveraging in a much more effective way and prevent problems before they happen. I mentioned some of the work we do on our consultation supervision side, where we engage before processing takes place. And most of the time, there are no issues because the concerns we've raised have been adequately addressed. And that, to me, is a good use of resources because it prevents problems happening, and it is in the better interest of individuals to prevent problems happening than having to address them after the fact. However, there will always be lots of cases where they have to be addressed after the fact, and that's why we have a large number of investigations currently open and are working as best we can to progress and conclude those cross-border investigations and bring them through the cooperation process to a conclusion. So I think it's an open debate as to what effective regulation looks like, and there's different views, and the academic world has particular views, and I think they would tend to agree that it's not all about fines and enforcement in that sense. So we do need to look at all of our functions under the GDPR and make sure that we're being active across all of the responsibilities we have.
Thank you so much, Dale, for this insightful contribution. Now, Lorena of Cisco, I'm sure you have lots of reactions based on our first discussant's comments, so please feel free to react to that. But I'd also be curious to know, what is your assessment of the GDPR's impact on, what are the tech firms saying as you're speaking from an industry perspective?
Yeah, thank you so much, Eileen. And thank you, Olivier and Dale, for your comments. I can certainly endorse many of the statements that particularly Olivier has made regarding the role of the GDPR and how it really helped company to take this as an opportunity more than a challenge to do a number of things. And that was certainly sure for us. So certainly the GDPR was the opportunity to up-level the discussion of privacy within our company and make it a true board discussion. In fact, we are required indeed to provide on a quarterly basis reports on how we're doing with the program itself, how much we need to improve, how much of the assessment that we made require remediation, as well as what is the ongoing oversight of any assessment that we have made in the past. It's been 2 years indeed, but the work did start very long before. So indeed, we actually worked for quite some time now to essentially assessing our house to make sure that it's in order, but also assessing the products that we do sell in the market and making sure that those also have had in privacy as a primary thought. And possibly on this second one is where really the GDPR helped. The privacy by design is certainly not a concept that is new with us in the privacy community, but it's certainly something that was really embraced as a result of the GDPR. I think the recognition of this important principle within the letter of law certainly made sure that everybody else outside, indeed, the privacy community will take this as a priority. And what we have seen in the major shift is really on the technical side of the company. So having our engineers thinking about privacy first, understanding that privacy is not something that you can solve with a policy well written or with a process that somehow makes sense, but it's really how do we make those requirements as a functional requirement, as the engineers will tell me, in the development of our products. And so particularly on that point for us, that's probably where we have made probably the most improvements in having privacy as part of our development lifecycle for our products and making sure that there are requirements, or how we call it, controls in the development phase of the product. So normally you will have an initial assessment with the engineers based on their idea or their development plan, and then you can provide, as a result of the assessment, controls that need to be put in place. One of them was mentioned many times by the engineers at Apple in the keynote that we heard about how do you make data minimization not just a letter of law again, but actually a requirement. So what does it mean for someone on the technical side when they receive that kind of input, which most of the time is very much about understanding what is that they're trying to achieve with their product and what is that they need in order to achieve that particular outcome. So what kind of data do you actually really need to have that particular outcome? It seems a very, I would say, simple thinking, but it's actually something that resonates quite well with someone that is actually under an increased pressure of pushing out products into the market and making sure that in doing so, they're actually creating a product that ultimately people will want to buy. So why am I saying this? It's because we have, I think as a Cisco, we do have a kind of a certainty that people will want to buy things that actually they feel that will actually protect them. So it's not only that they function well, but they're actually able to protect their own privacy. And this is recently confirmed by the latest consumers report that we have published in October. If you want to learn more, you can go on our website. It's on trust.cisco.com. You can find it. But essentially what we learned is that even in this time of plug, as Wojciech said, we find that people really want products to actually protect them. So even working remotely, 60% of the consumers that we questioned worldwide, we surveyed worldwide, they said that they feel, the 60% feels that they need to use tools that will enable them to work remotely but still protect their privacy. And around 56%, they even say that we understand the pandemic, we understand that we need to share some of our information. However, we don't want the privacy laws to change just a bit. So they feel that the privacy is important as actually fighting the pandemic. There is also 36% that said, well, we feel that if we need to share some of our data to help fight the COVID outbreak, then certainly we can do that, as well as that strikes the right balance. And that goes very much on what Olivier said also in his speech, indeed, that GDPR has proven to be very flexible to adjust to unprecedented times, like the one that we're living now, that is still gaining a lot of, it is a recognized tool also for consumers to feel protected. And at the other side of the coin is that also company feels that they're very much protected. The other thing that I think the GDPR also did quite well, and it was certainly a very nice exercise for us, is that it challenged us to really understand what are the data that we had, our data house look like. And so making sense to it, remediate where it's necessary. Also pushing companies to lead with data. And naturally, we lead with products. Naturally, we lead with revenues. Naturally, we lead with physical assets. I think this is what a lot has helped change, is leading with data. And if anything, the pandemic told us that indeed we should lead with data, because when everything goes off, right, when there are no physical assets, the things that we're going to share most are indeed data. The other thing that I want to say about the toolbox, and then with that, I can take any question that you have, Elaine. But there are indeed some toolbox where we will want and encourage the data protection authorities, in this case, indeed Dale, and then Olivier as well, to actually support even more broadly. For example, instruments like the Code of Conduct is something that particularly me, but also other companies in the same industry were pushing forward. It's actually in the latest stage of approvals by DDPP. It is the Code of Conduct. And the Code of Conduct is a tool that we feel in this point in time can be very powerful to disseminate rules of conduct across an industry on a particular service, like in our case, the Code of Conduct, and provide also and reinforce also I would say sureness or safeness across the consumer side. Because if the rules are clear and they are undertaken and endorsed by company, and they become really part of their compliance practice and their way and their market differentiation, then that will give also will make feel the consumers that privacy is not only addressed from a legal perspective, but it's actually part of the way we do business. I'll finish it off to comment, obviously, with the with the standard contractual clauses, even more importantly with the DPP guidance. Certainly it has been, I think between the 11th and the 12th of November, we certainly had very eventful days. I think some of that we will still need to see how they play out. They certainly are a game changer in the way we need to think about data. And so one comment that I will have is, what is that are we really aiming to? Are we aiming to actually making sure that we drive with data and we protect people? Because indeed, we're not only protecting them, we're actually protecting people, as the consumers reminded us. Or are we driving for forces of fears, and therefore if we localize everything, then that it's possibly the only way out. That being said, obviously that represents the challenges for many industries, so it will be interesting to see how the standard contractual clauses in the final draft look like. I particularly like them very much. I like the modular approach. I think they're very reasonable. However, we need to see how we balance them also with the recommendation of the DPP and the additional requirements that bring, which I think, in my point of view, that should be read in addition to the new standard contractual clauses. So with that, hopefully that was exhaustive enough. Aline.
Sorry, yes, I'm muting myself. Yes, it was very comprehensive, but I still have questions for you, if that's okay. And I still have 4 or 5 minutes with you, so I'm going to use them. So thanks for mentioning everything you mentioned. You referred to how industry is taking privacy seriously. Now the bar has been raised for the GDPR. You mentioned codes of conduct and maybe some self-regulation policies and standards, which very often companies do adopt. We've seen that with AI guidelines, for instance. And you mentioned this consumer privacy surveys. And now you said the GDPR has improved sort of trust among users, potentially, if I misunderstood, you can correct me. But what about industry as well? Because I'm not sure it's always that easy to take on board new regulations. I always take the example of the Bitkom survey that's annual, and that we went from 45% of respondents saying data protection requirements being the main obstacle to the development of new technologies in 2017 to over 70% of respondents saying that after the GDPR was enacted. And another question I have, was about the COVID. We've heard Olivier said that GDPR was an enabler of trust, and you said also it proved to be rather flexible during the pandemic. But I'm wondering that the COVID applications, if that was the case, if that was, the GDPR had been an enabler of trust, why was it so hard to make people use those apps? I know in France now they're using it, but that's because you can download their special forms to go outside through the apps. And I suspect this is the main reason why people are using the app now.
So thank you for the question. So for the first one, which I will address first, how hard it is. I think how hard it is how hard is your commitment to actually make it happen. As in anything in life, right? It's hard as, you get the right people to actually drive, move the obstacles. I cannot tell you that it was done in a day. That's absolutely not true. It was a very long journey, at least for us. It's something that changes the way we're looking at certain aspects. So I made the example of our products, which probably is one of the most impacting, but also the way we will actually interacting with our own tools internally to Cisco. So I wanted just to make clear that this is certainly not a joke or something that, it was just as anything else. It was a true revolution. Now, I think for us, at least, that have been around for quite some time, is even before the GDPR, it looked like something that it was just a segue to what we were trying to build even before. If anything, GDPR accelerated certain activities that we were already doing. So I think it was not that hard to do the assessment like it was probably before 2016. But however, I think it was also an opportunity to see it as something that we could differentiate ourselves. I mean, I remember working on the BCRs that we got at Cisco, and that was actually an exercise that before was very difficult to do. Then with the GDPR, it was immediately something that everybody jumped on because they see the value of it. It was actually an exercise that we've done mostly internally, I would say. And it's actually a certification that we got in a very reasonable time frame. It didn't took us more than 6 or 8 months, if I remember correctly. Why is that? It's probably because the work that we've done at the beginning, it was very intense, and it was certainly accelerated by all of that. Same thing goes putting, our endless hours on creating a code of conduct for the industry. This is something that before it probably would make less sense, but because we understand that we need somehow to have an external validation. So the more external validation you have, the better you can go. Then a code of conduct can also be the opportunity. And now, thanks to the GDPR and the way now code of conduct are drafted in the GDPR, then it becomes a tool that company will think about. Let's remember that before the GDPR, under the directive, the code of conduct were not very good. And the one that we created actually fell apart. And the reason for that is because they were created by association or the DPAs themselves. So it's not something that was, if you like, a concerted, if you like, instrument, something created by the industry for the industry, and then with the seal of the Data Protection Authority. So that it's actually very powerful. Now, on the pandemic that you asked, so why am I saying, why do there is a difficulty? I think the difficulty a lot is around the understanding of the technical implication of developing the app. I don't think the app per se, it should be a problem. If it is the sure knowledge of how they are developed, it's actually more consumable. Because if you understand how the app works, if you understand what it means to rely on GPS versus Bluetooth, then maybe that changes the way you think about the app itself. However, I don't think that that's shared knowledge. And probably the fact that the consumer reacted, they want privacy, but they seem to look at privacy like, don't bother me or don't know anything about me, rather than it's an exercise to make sure that while yourself as a human being is protected, at the same time you participate and share responsibility with the I would say as a citizen. That is something that probably was not well understood. I thought that was possibly what it was. It was also, I must say, I think in this pandemic, if there is one thing that we can see is that while governments did an awesome job to try to keep everybody calm and possibly try to navigate uncertain times, there were a lot of also misinformation about what kind of data we actually need to protect ourselves. So probably the messaging also on that side, I don't think that helped a lot, and possibly the political message I'm talking, and possibly didn't make the work of the DPAs easier even in providing guidance in that sense.
Thank you so much, Lorena. I understand I have to let you go, but thank you for joining us today. And unfortunately, we only have 8 minutes left, and I apologize that we had a slight delay. So I'm just going to make sure that William of Google and Estelle of Access Now get a bit of a chance to share their views. So please, William, maybe you can follow up on Lorena's contribution on your assessment of the GDPR and what you've heard today. Thank you.
Sure, I'll try and limit my remarks in the interest of time, and perhaps just focus a little bit on what best practice compliance with GDPR look like inside Google today, as well as perhaps sharing some thoughts about the experience of the last 2 years on how tools and frameworks under the GDPR might provide some ongoing, might support the ongoing objectives of strong data protection, innovation, and free movement of data. I think there's 4 areas that I'd like to kind of comment or highlight. One is that I think we've got a proud tradition in Google in leading the way on building strong privacy and data protection tools that really deliver on the practical promise of GDPR for users. I'll highlight a few of those. We've got My Account, which is now visited by 20 million users a day, and I think answers the question that I'm most commonly asked about Google, which is, what does Google know about me? Well, we've built a tool that gives people very transparently, very openly that answer, and really delivers in a practical way, to my view, on the transparency challenge that has been set down by GDPR. We've also massively enhanced controls that are practical, like auto-delete, where users can choose 3 or 18 months as a default retention period for their data, and anything that falls out with those windows is automatically and continuously deleted. But I wanted, really, second remark I would make is really just to build on some of the remarks that were made perhaps in the keynotes about the need to...
Please be brief, because we have 6 minutes left. We have a hard stop, and I still want to hear Estelle. Thank you so much. I apologize. Please go on. Hello?
Oh, sorry, you wanted me to stop? No?
No, just go on, but please try to be brief, just so that we can hear Estelle for a few minutes. Thank you.
Sure. Perhaps then just one final remark in that case, which is really around delivering on the promise of using GDPR being scaled up through industry and SMEs. And I think we've built and invested heavily in tools to allow third parties and SMEs and industry to do that, such as TensorFlow, our federated learning tool, the data transfer product. But since we are rushed, just maybe in closing, I think 2 years of living with GDPR have kind of taught us much. I think much of it has worked, and we've heard a lot about the promise and the opportunity that one-stop shop has to create consistency for users. And I think that basically, from my view, a lot of strong work has been done, and there's an opportunity, I think, exactly as the point has been made today, to leverage seals, codes, and certifications to enable scalable data protection and more global interoperability, so that the promise of the European standards scaling up through tools and flexible mechanisms globally is truly delivered on. So I'll stop there in the interest of time and pass back.
Thank you, William. I really want to apologize. I know it takes time for everyone to prepare those panels, but I think we still should include Estelle's perspective because it represents the civil society. So please, Estelle, take the floor for the remaining time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'll try to keep it short. Sorry, we don't have more time to discuss. So if I have to sum up from civil society perspective, how the past more than 2 years has been with the GDPR is that the GDPR has been a legislative success, but so far it's an enforcement failure. And with more than 2 years in now, we unfortunately have to admit that it's yet to deliver its objective. The failure is not because of the law. The Commission and the legislator in Parliament and Council delivered a law that has become a global standard and hopefully will be the basis for the EU digital single market as new proposals are coming up. But the failure is coming from enforcement, which was already mentioned several times, or rather the lack of enforcement. And this situation is not working for citizens. As soon as the GDPR entered into application, many of us came to the DPAs, came to company doing data request access, using our rights. But more than 2 years later, a huge part of those complaints remain unaddressed. And of course, we have some large success and some big cases like the Trumps ones, but you can't expect every citizen to be like Trumps, or you can't even expect every NGO to have the same amount of resilience, efficiency, or resources as Mike Trumps. So we need to fix this situation because it's not acceptable for citizens, but it's also not acceptable for a large number of companies that have made the efforts to comply and change their programs to be in line with GDPR. Because at the moment, if there is not enough enforcement, it means that there is a sort of business as usual running with a few companies that are not respecting the law. And because it's not being enforced, it creates an unfair situation in the market where those who are not respecting the law are put into, have an advantage over those who play by the rules. And enforcement is the only tool that can address this. I know we're pressed by time, but if I can leave with one last message, I know we are discussing new legislative proposal in the EU, from AI, from Data Governance Act to the Digital Single Market or DMA even, and they will be here to put forward tools that are here to tackle abuse by big tech companies and provide fair competition in the market. But we do also have tools like that under the GDPR. They're just not being utilized, and enforcement is key to make sure that we do use those tools, and also as lesson learned for this upcoming proposal to know that enforcement mechanism needs to really be strengthened if we want the objectives that are being put forward by the European Union, which are laudable ones, to be delivered. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And again, our apologies for having to, unfortunately, cut short. It's a very interesting debate, and we had very nice exchange with questions before the panel. But hopefully we'll get together again for a similar conversation very soon. So thank you all very much, and my apologies for having rushed it. Thank you to all participants for joining, and a big thank you to Forum Europe for organizing the event today. And we will now leave you again in good company, because you will hear from John Whittingdale, who's the UK's Minister of State for Media and Data. So stay tuned, there are exciting sessions coming up today, and we hope that you will enjoy all of them if you can. Have a great day. Thank you, everyone.